Welcome to the Your Lifestyle is Your Medicine podcast, where we do deep dives into topics of mind, body, and spirit. Through these conversations, you'll hear practical advice and effective strategies to improve your health and ultimately add health span to your lifespan. I'm Ed Paget. I'm an osteopath and exercise physiologist with a special interest in longevity. Today, my guest is Paul Weeden, who is an integrative therapist and embodiment coach. He is the founder of Be Authentic on Purpose, which helps burnt out and frustrated professionals align with authenticity and their purpose. Now, today, Paul helps us understand the difference between psychologists, counselors, and coaches. And through his experience, he shares with us how our live-to-work culture can actually be bad for us and what to do about it. Also, he shares his opinions on why there is an epidemic of anxiety and depression in young people today. Spoiler alert. It might have to do with the way people eat, sleep, and play. So, Paul, welcome to the show.
Thank you very much for having me on, Ed. It's great to be here.
No problems. All right, let's hit the ground running. One question I really want to ask every therapist is, why do people go to therapy?
That's a great question to start with. I think it's a variety of reasons, but I think the fundamental underpinning it is feeling unhappy with themselves and to a point where they can't manage themselves, and often somebody else can't manage how they're being, and sometimes that person, often a partner, nudges them towards a therapist, which has happened for me many times with clients.
Okay, so can't manage. That sounds like therapists speak to me. Can't manage themselves. What does that mean?
Yeah, so I think it shows up as poor self-care, overeating, undersleeping often is a big one, relying too much on probably alcohol and sugar, caffeine, poor relationships. So very often people will be very irritable, very frustrated, unable to cope with, little day-to-day things kind of turn into big things. It's a bit like the straw that broke the camel's back effect, I think. So I think that's kind of how it starts to show up. And then if not addressed, it often becomes bigger and might lead to, quite more serious things like a partner saying, I can't live with you anymore, or a boss saying, we're not sure if you're right for this team anymore, or at worst, sometimes legal problems.
Wow. Okay.
Yeah.
And then from a health span and longevity point of view and a lifestyle medicine point of view, you picked up on some things there, which is if they're not sleeping properly, and sleep is what I think is some of the foundations of health, that's a problem. If they're relying on caffeine or sugar, then that's in the 6 tenets of lifestyle medicine. That is what we could say is toxic substances. And then losing their job or their partner, which is community. And so a lot of people say to me, well, why are you talking about therapy when it's lifestyle medicine? And right there is the sort of the crux of the whole thing, that everything comes together when if a person is, in your words, is not managing themselves properly, it's going to trickle out and affect everything else.
100%. Yeah. I think that's really hitting the nail on the head there. Yes, and so it will, after when other people start to complain about us, we tend to then be more likely to take notice, and if someone has some degree of wisdom, I guess they might take the opportunity to either pick up a self-help book or book an appointment with a psychologist maybe, or a counselor or psychotherapist or coach. And what they often find is that underneath the symptoms, the poor sleep and the lifestyle issues, is lack of satisfaction with life itself, which people are often reluctant to admit because we tend to sort of feel guilty and maybe even ashamed of admitting, I'm actually not that happy with who I am. I'm not that happy with the life I've chosen, or the life that's happened to me is often how it will be initially presented. I mean, most of the time in the first few sessions of most of the therapy I've done, it's all about other people. People say, my partner does this to me, my boss does that to me, my friends do this to me, and it takes quite a while before people start saying, or being open to the idea, well, what do you do to them or at them, or what makes them feel, unhappy about being around us. And that usually takes a bit more time. So a lot of the short-term models that we see in the NHS in the UK and healthcare insurance companies offering it 6 sessions, 12 sessions, it's fine for an introduction to self-development and better self-care, but I don't think it goes deep enough or stays. It's a bit like watching a really good film for a couple of hours. You can get really into it and really connect with the characters, but unless you watch it again or maybe read the book it's based on, it will just become another story. And so we need to sort of kind of keep going deeper and deeper into what it is that happens with us for others and happens to ourselves via the choices that we've made, or the choices that we feel what we've had put upon us, perhaps at first.
But you mentioned the beginning of that, you mentioned psychotherapy, psychologist, therapist, or coach.
Yeah.
Can you define some of those terms for people who might be listening to this?
Yeah. So my understanding is, I have looked into being all of these at different times, and sort of settled on integrative counselling and coaching for a variety of reasons. But psychologists and psychiatrists generally work with a medical model, and it's psychologists are more like doctors. If you read the kind of exams they take and the manuals they read, it's more about how genes work and how receptors in the brain work and this kind of thing, neurons and that kind of thing. So psychotherapists tend to work with the past a lot more and the unconscious, and it's basically underpinned on the concept that you are the result of your past and your family, your mother in particular, and they sort of constantly looking for how that's playing out in the present. Counsellors do a bit of all of that, but also tends to be more present focused, and historically it's over a shorter period of time, although these days often people are going for longer term counselling, and there is even short-term psychotherapy models now. Coaching, I would say, is predominantly future focused, and what are we going to be doing tomorrow or next week, and how are we going to go into that, how are we going to show up. But actually, if you listen to conversations, if you found on YouTube conversations between psychologists, counsellors, psychotherapists and coaches, it would be hard to distinguish a lot of the time the differences. I think ultimately it's all about a good relationship with somebody that's impartial, who has your best interests, wants a good outcome for you, that's not their own idea, and they have an awareness of what their own idea of what's best for you is, but that won't be the driving force in the relationship. It will be about what's best for you.
So why would someone pick one of those particular disciplines over another? Like, is there a situation where it's like, okay, it's a really good idea to see a psychologist, really good idea to see a coach, other than the finances? Because in England, where we're both from, there is this National Health Service which pays for some of these sessions, but most people will be paying for this sort of thing out of pocket.
Yeah, no, that's a really good question. So I think most people probably go on to something like Counselling Directory or BACP, find a therapist, and then what they find is thousands of counsellors and psychotherapists, and those two labels can get a bit muddled, but ultimately I would suggest that somebody should be looking for somebody who has experience and enjoys working with the kind of challenges you're facing, rather than have they done 5 years of training working with personality disorders. I think you probably only really need a psychotherapist or a psychologist or a psychiatrist if you can't solve your problems yourself with the help of a counsellor or coach, because it means that you possibly have a borderline personality disorder or something more severe than that, which is not most people. Most people can solve their problems, and it becomes quite obvious when people have that, because one, they don't show up for sessions very often or on time. Two, they complain a lot about the running of the session or how you do your work. They don't really let you do your job, so it becomes really confusing in my experience. And what they want from you, and do they actually want to be there? And then there's this constant kind of invitation to reject them. And then when you sort of suggest, I'd really like to help you find somebody better than me to work with you, then that gets taken as a rejection rather than an offer to improve the situation. So it often feels like a lose-lose situation. Whereas with most working people in the population, they do want help, they do want advice, actually, which actually often goes against counselling kind of training. But actually we do end up saying, well, there's this great book or there's this great workshop, I think you should check it out. So I think I don't know what percentage, but it's probably 80% of the population. They, do have the ability to do really well in most counselling or psychotherapy or coaching, or a combination of those things over time. And I think these things should be ongoing. It shouldn't just be 6 months of counselling and then I'm done, because it will wear off. And also there'll be something else that will come up that you could probably benefit from learning about.
Mm-hmm. So you mentioned that some people like to have advice, this book or something like that. But when I've talked to psychotherapists, they say that actually that's not the role of the therapist. You can't, in fact, you're not allowed to give advice. What's that about? If someone's coming to you for advice, they're saying, like, I've got this problem, really looking for solutions. And why would a profession say you can't give advice?
Yeah, so I think, well, if you go back to the origins of psychoanalysis, which is what psychotherapy, where it comes from, the patient came in the room and lay on a couch, like a long, like chaise longue kind of couch, and the therapist, or the analyst at the time, as they called themselves, was actually out of sight and was kind of behind the patient with a notebook. And the patient just lay down and just started to freely, kind of free association, I think was the clinical term. And it was just basically just saying whatever came to their mind. So it might be they just started saying, I really don't want to be here today. This is rubbish. I don't know how it's going to help me. And the analyst would just kind of listen and sort of just take notes. And that went on for, sometimes 2 or 3 times a week. And eventually they maybe 6 months or years down the line, even, they would offer these kind of analyses of, it sounds like, you've had a really difficult time with in your childhood with your mother, and your absent father left you feeling abandoned, and you struggle to form attachments with people, and you struggle to trust people, for example, which is quite common for a lot of people, and they probably know that to some extent already, whether maybe not fully consciously, but on some level they probably, most people will know, didn't have a great time when my mum or dad wasn't around, or he wasn't reliable and trustworthy. That's left me not trusting men, perhaps, in particular. So I think it comes from a sort of outdated model, that I think that was based on the idea that the unconscious would reveal everything, and therefore we would have all the answers from that, which is true probably if you have a long enough period of time. But if somebody's, a working professional, maybe a parent as well, they don't have time to come to therapy 2 or 3 times a week for years and just wait for this kind of prescription to be read out, this kind of analysis. So they don't know about how the theories have come about, so they assume that they're going to get some advice, and actually, if it's probably not something we do in the very early stages of working with somebody. But once you've built a relationship with somebody and they're still stuck, like they're not going off and finding, oh yeah, I went and tried a new dance class this week, and I went to watch some theatre I haven't seen before, and I'm trying these things, and I'm pushing out my comfort zone. Then they kind of are telling us, whether they say it or not, I need a bit more than this. So why shouldn't we suggest things that could be beneficial to them? So I've in my embodiment coaching training, what we do in that is we use the 4 elements from the ancient Chinese. I believe it's Chinese originally, but it may be from somewhere else. But basically, earth, fire, air, and water we use as personality types. So if someone were naturally earthy and grounded, and very reliable and consistent. A bit like, maybe I'm going to be a stereotype here, but like use a stereotype, but like a librarian, for example, sort of very fundamental, very consistent, reliable, methodical. That kind of person is going to probably have used that in other areas of their life. This kind of the way they cook, the way they make a meal, the way they shop, the way they go about their life will be quite sort of prescriptive and consistent. But the downside is it's probably lacking spontaneity. It's probably lacking the ability to be really expressive and energized, perhaps. So they might need to bring in some air or water quality to water for relational quality, and then air for creativity in this model. Fire is assertiveness. So fire tends to be viewed as being anger and a bad thing, but actually it can be really healthy. It can be like somebody being handed maybe a document that's maybe for a project they're working on, or they might be sitting in a restaurant and the waiter puts down the food in front of them, and rather than explode in anger and say, what the hell's this, they might just say, no, not like that, like this, thank you, and just hand it back. So, and I think that that would be an example of using fire in a healthy way to kind of make the point. It's not correct. I'm not going to discuss that with you. Please just fix it. Thank you. So we can kind of practice. Somebody who's not comfortable with that way of being will likely say, oh, I could never speak to somebody like that. What if they're offended? It's like, yeah, well, why? Maybe it isn't all about them. Maybe it's also about you and the fact that your meal was delivered incorrectly when you made it very clear you asked for medium rare steak, for example, and it wasn't. It was overdone. So you might benefit from, rather than getting into a long drawn out discussion about why it's not correct, just not like this, like that, thank you very much. So we can learn these qualities through things, activities in our lives, hobbies really, dancing, acting, singing, making things with our hands, martial arts, anything really that challenges us to get out of our comfort zone and requires a different level of skill, a different skill set that we may not be accustomed to or comfortable with in everyday life. So we can kind of find something that would give us that. Somebody going skydiving, for example, could, that was really, for most people, that would be scary. The height, the speed, the adrenaline would be, a lot. They might shy away from it for many years, but actually the benefits afterwards, that they've overcome that fear and that challenge, would be like, you could feel like, I could do anything now. I can tell someone how I really feel without worrying about offending them. I don't need to get really angry to make my point. I can just say, this is what I want, thanks, please, let it be done, kind of thing. So I think that's kind of, that can be really helpful in helping people. So you're not telling them what to go and do, but saying, so it sounds like you're this kind of person. You're very relational. You're very watery, for example. You're very social. But maybe you lack boundaries. Maybe you don't say. How do you find saying no? Lots of people are very relational, very social, people pleasers. They tend to be, often we'll label them people pleasers. It's a clinical term, and that generally means that they just say yes to everything. So they're overwhelmed at work. They've got massive deadlines. Somebody says, "Can you get this to me by this afternoon?" And they just go, "Oh yeah, okay." And then afterwards they resent it. And they feel bad about it. They wish that they hadn't said yes, but they don't know how to say no without either offending or risking, their status. They want to be seen as strong or reliable, or somebody that's always a yes person. Why? Why do you want to be like that when actually it's making the work you're already responsible for harder, and arguably you're more likely to make mistakes. And it's making your personal life more and more likely to be unpleasant, because you're going to go home, you won't be able to stop thinking about these extra things you've got to do. And actually, there was probably somebody else who was more suitable to take on that task, but they just didn't think of them.
Interesting.
So,
interesting. So how did you get from, I don't know, your early education into this 4 elements? What was your journey there?
Wow. So let me see if I can put it in a nutshell. So when I was leaving school, my main passion was music, and yeah, I was obsessed with bands and singers and guitar players, and was basically, you know, really convinced that that was going to be my life, and I didn't really worry about much else. And actually, probably if I had have just carried on with that,
Mm.
I probably would have got more out of it than I was led to believe further down the line. But at a very young age, I was just left school. I was 16, 17. Before I was 18 years old, I was playing in these pubs around the southeast of England with my band, and we were getting support some quite I wouldn't say famous, but professional musicians. You know, people who had before been in bands like Iron Maiden, and UK band called Dogster Moore. Played with them when I was very young, and yeah, so they were kind of sort of like B-list kind of, you know, like artists really who could, you know, tour the world basically and make a living out of music, but they weren't multi-millionaires and they weren't driving around in Ferraris. But I was getting to experience this at a very young age, and often they would, you know, kind of fall asleep in these pubs after drinking, you know, lots, and fall asleep on the sofas, and we would as well, you know, and that was sort of, you know, I wasn't really old enough to be there, and I wasn't legally, and you know, and that was kind of my life for a couple of years till I was 18. Then I got to sort of 18, the music scene kind of changed, and grunge rock came in, and the rave scene became huge, and it became sort of unfashionable to sort of be into kind of hard rock and heavy metal music. So that made me feel uncomfortable, and I didn't know how to adapt to it. And I started looking at these guys, looking at myself and thinking, I don't want to be like that at 40. I don't want to be sleeping on a pub sofa in the Oliver Twist in Colchester. You know, I want to be,
Got a
you know, I
big
either want to
picture of
be,
it.
yeah. It just kind of hit me, and just the kind of people that I was around just didn't seem to have, they didn't seem to, I couldn't seem to find people who had the sort of, the much higher level professionalism
Yeah.
and the attitude to really, you know, go for a big record deal and have a big hit and be no. I just thought that's going to take much higher, you know, kind of standards really. So
Mm.
I kind of dabbled around still in music. I did some courses, but I also, my parents' advice was, you know, you're giving this a decent go. You're 18, 19 now approaching. Maybe you should go and do some other things. So I sort of dabbled in hospitality and the fashion industry, and yeah, did some media courses and drama. I looked at sort of
Mm.
singing in theatre work and that kind of thing. And this kind of went on for till I was, you know, in my sort of 30s really. So 10 to 15 years, I guess, of just kind of trying things and never being that happy and living for weekends. I remember my motto for a while was to live for weekends. I love going out partying and kind of, you know, clubbing with my friends and, you know, listening to great dance music all
Mm.
weekend, and then just not feeling very good all week
For a
for
week. So
yeah, yeah.
when did the sort of the counseling and therapy come in?
Okay, so I discovered meditation and self development books. Neil Donald Walsh was a big one
Right.
for a while, and
Yeah.
Wayne Dyer. I was really into his stuff in my sort of early 30s, and then I started to think, well, you know, how is this useful to me? It makes me feel better, but what do I actually really want to do in my life? So I was going along to some meditation workshops and some sort of weekend self-development, inner child kind of
Mhm.
stuff like this, and then just I think I met one or two people who were counselors and psychotherapists at some of these things, and I was like, oh, that's interesting. Buddhism also and started to show up, and Stoicism and these kind of philosophies became interesting to me. So it just kind of came to me in a sort of light bulb moment. Why don't you look at doing a counseling training course? So before I knew it, within a week, I think, of that having that idea, I was on a evening class doing counselling skills and theory level 2 and 3 over the next year. Did those, and then I went on to do a professional diploma, BACP accredited diploma, and yeah, then was very much you know, in the direction of I'm gonna be a counsellor of some sort, and you know, I'm really, you know, really excited about that. Went on to work in the NHS for a couple of years, and then schools. I worked in schools with young people as a schools counsellor, and then sort of developed my private practice alongside. And also went to work in London with professionals in the city. So yeah, mainly lawyers and bankers and other
Wow.
people like
That's
that.
three very vastly different demographics. So the NHS,
Yeah.
children,
Yeah.
and then professionals in the city. But what sort
That's
of
right.
clients were you seeing in the NHS?
So they were often NHS patients who were unwell sometimes. Sometimes they were being seen by doctors or specialists for other reasons, but having counselling as an extra.
Mhm.
Often they were parents who were just overwhelmed with their life. Some of them had, many children, and they were like single parenting. A lot were unemployed, or had some kind of diagnosis, clinical depression, perhaps, hadn't worked for some time. And yeah, lots of them were just everyday people. Sometimes they were just policemen and, you know, people that worked in shops near where the practice was. And yeah, I thought it was a small town, and I kind of would see people everywhere I went who I worked with, which was strange. And
Right.
so yeah, so they were all kinds of people really. And then obviously the schools, I worked in a private school, and I've worked in some state schools with mainly 11 upwards, so secondary school age generally.
Mhm.
And then the professionals, as I say, were sort of high end city professionals, lawyers, bankers, mainly insurance company CEOs. But what I noticed across the board was that most people had these kind of their private lives, their social lives, their what they did outside of their work or their study just seemed to be, I'd like to find a better word, but I'm going to use meaningless. Like
Wow.
I mean, so by that I just mean that they were just basically coming home and watching TV and Netflix more recently, or going to the pub after work is a really big one. Yeah, so a lot of professionals would go to the pub on Friday after work and stay there till late. Go to work Friday morning, stay there till late, and then go to the pub, which was they'd have like a local pub near their office, which they would use, and they would just hang out all evening with their colleagues, and then sometimes they would go home with each other with friends, and then spend some Saturday together. So they weren't kind of getting this kind of separation between the work and their personal life. So when I'd ask them about this, they would often say, "Well, I don't really see my friends from outside work very often. I'm not really in touch anymore." And I'd say, "Well, do you have any hobbies you do outside of work?" I used to play football, or I used to play netball or volleyball, whatever it was, but I don't have time for that these days. So I try to sort of get them to sort of think about how can you have a healthy social life with people in the room who you're in the office with on a Monday morning, who could judge you for your conduct if you
Mhm.
had a moment or two where maybe you didn't behave in your best light, which everybody
On
does at
the
times.
company's interest, if if you
Uh,
transgress some sort of
yeah,
HR manual guidelines.
exactly,
Yeah.
this kind of thing, or you just are in the wrong place at the wrong
Mhm.
time.
Mhm.
And maybe you've had one too many drinks and somebody said something you didn't like, and you just fired back with something that it turns out that person was somebody connected with a company, or somebody that knows your boss or something. I mean, so they would just never think about these kind of things. And occasionally I did have to work with people who were in legal disputes with their employers over similar things where there was a boundary issue. But arguably it was often down to the company's policies that didn't encourage healthy boundaries in the first place. And we don't recommend that you all hang out together at the weekend. Of course, if it's somebody's birthday or it's a special occasion,
Yeah.
of course we're going to get together. But generally, we think it's better that they wouldn't have those often. So usually my client would win, because it was like, well, you haven't actually advised me on that. But it still nonetheless got them into often a rather unpleasant situation sometimes.
So these people, they live to work,
Mm.
and this is a very American thing as well. So
Yeah,
it's coming
yeah,
from across the Atlantic to England. But
yeah.
another way we could say that is perhaps they haven't found their purpose, unless their purpose is work. But
Mm.
and
Mm.
here's something that I learned when I did my performance coaching course with Hinsa, and I mentioned this in a previous podcast. But Aki Hinsa, when he would start working with a young racing driver, he would ask them, what do you want to achieve in racing? Like, oh, I want to be a world champion. It's okay. What else do you have in your life? Do you have a business? Do you have a family? Do you have friends? Do you have a charity? And
Mm.
they'll be like, usually young racing drivers will be like, no, just 100% focused
Yeah,
on the
yeah.
winning. And he was like, well, what if you crash? What if the team drops you? What if, all these sort of things? Same with work, right? What if you get fired, or what if you get transferred?
Mm,
And he
mm,
called it, his analogy was like a plinth or a mantle across a fireplace. And you need certain pillars holding it up. And if you have one pillar,
mm,
which is winning the world championships, if that
mm,
doesn't work out or something happens, then your whole life comes crashing down. And so he
mm,
encouraged his young athletes to have multiple pillars. And the
yeah, yeah.
story goes, where he learned this from was from an Olympic Ethiopian runner called Haile Selassie. I don't know if you remember him in the sort of the
Yeah,
90s.
yeah, 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 yeah.
So to any other Olympian, their identity is the fact that they are training for the Olympics. He's like, what do you do? Oh, I'm an Olympic athlete, or I'm an athlete aspiring to the Olympics. To
Mm,
him, in his local, in his place in, I think, I can't remember where he was from exactly, but in Ethiopia, they called him the father that runs. So he
mm,
had
mm,
children. That's number one. Secondary
mm,
to that was his running career. And
mm,
the guy who put Hinster together, Aki Hinster, was actually a surgeon, and he had to operate on his Achilles at one point before the 1996 Atlanta Olympics. And he said to him,
wow.
he said, this might not work out. You might not be able to run again. And
Mm.
Aki Hinster was very nervous about the surgery. And Haile Selassie says, so? You're like, it's only running. You're like, whatever, let's do the surgery, we'll
Right.
see. And you can imagine, like, any Western Olympian would not have that attitude. And so from that, Aki Hinson was like, this is the attitude we need to thrive in this world of sport. And so
Yeah,
where I'm going with this is, you're working with these professionals.
yeah.
There's no difference between the amount of hours and the commitment these guys have than
Hmm.
there is an Olympic athlete. I see that it's the same for most of them. And
Hmm.
yet they're not looking wider than their one role or their one job.
No, no.
And yeah.
Yeah. So, and actually, their organisation is often encouraging that and actually pushing it. I've seen it so many times where I've discussed with somebody in a meeting. So, what are you going to do this week to make a little change? They're going, well, I'm going to, maybe they're going to get in touch with their old football club, see if there's a role for them, or maybe they're going to go out and try something new. Maybe they're going to try some Brazilian jiu-jitsu or something. It's like, great, that sounds really great. How are you feeling about it? Yeah, really, really looking forward to it. Next week, what's happened? I didn't go. All right, okay, what happened? Well, this kind of thing came up at work, and I was about to leave, and they were like, well, this really needs to be done by the morning. We're kind of all expected to stay now, and this would be at 6 p.m. often. It's like, oh, okay, so they would stay, um, and not, and it's like, okay, well, how do you feel as a result of that? Well, kind of had to do it, but I'm really, they usually say I'm really pissed off that I didn't get to go and do the thing I needed to go and do for myself. And this would be an ongoing pattern, and the people running these organizations just don't get that, there are boundaries, there has to be boundaries. Nobody dies if these things don't get done by tomorrow morning. There's no kind of compromising or looking at what's the consequences of. There is no consequences to them. They're often unaccountable, which is taking me into another direction of things that I find very difficult about the business world. But so how do we help people with that? Because that's obviously people don't want to lose their jobs. They need income. They need to pay their mortgages and the rent. They need to keep their families safe. All these things are important. So I think it's kind of a slow drip of kind of educating everybody who works, and then just everybody actually altogether, that life is more than just your work.
Mhm.
The work's important, obviously. If something unexpected, that's dangerous, that's potentially life-threatening. If you work in if you're some sort of doctor or something, things may be different. You might have to do emergency surgery sometimes late at night. I get that. But generally for most people, that isn't the case. So if something's a little bit delayed by a few hours in the morning, nobody's going to mind that much. If the new iPhone came out at midday rather than 9 a.m., would anyone care? No,
Yeah.
they would just queue up for a few more hours, people that want to do that. And everyone else would just wait a few more hours. It would just be like, in a way, it makes it more exciting, doesn't it? If you think about it, it's not. But
Right.
people literally, act as if it's really bad if we don't get this done. And it's like, is it? You know, is it really that bad if something comes out a few hours later than expected, or you send an email in the morning rather than the evening, or you solve a problem in the morning rather than the evening? It's actually not a bad thing. So yes, yeah, exactly. So I've put together this ebook called Six Steps to Live More Authentically on Purpose. And the premise of that is that the more bit. So it's like, I get that you're not going to go from who you are today to being 100% authentic and on purpose. And on purpose, I mean, you know, your life is as purposeful and meaningful as possible. But there are little things that we can do to help with that. So I would suggest, you know, connect with somebody who's wiser and perhaps more knowledgeable than we currently are. So you know, you might read a great kind of self-development book that's got information in it by somebody who's perhaps done some things that you haven't done yet, achieved some things in life that you'd like to achieve or similar. So it could be a guru, somebody like, you know,
a mentor.
A mentor perhaps. Yeah, it's like, say, like Bruce Lee, Muji perhaps. You know, well, Bruce Lee was a very philosophical man, even though he was a martial artist, but he did come out with some fantastic, you know, quotes that I've used to this day, like, you know, be like water, you know, like kind of be, you know, like sort of flow and move like water and these kind of things. And yeah, so Gandhi, obviously, Muji, but you got to find your own, you know. So you might find that through exploring Buddhism, Stoicism, Gnosticism, even Christianity. It may not be a religion, actually, it may be something else, but something that you sense, or somebody has told you, know, that there's wisdom here, and here's why, and here's what I recommend you take a look at as a first glance. So be open to different things, look at lots of different things, make time for it each week to actually, you know, research and study something that's new to you, that you find interesting. And then I think the next thing is really finding an activity that's physical, that uses your body in a way that challenges it and helps it to grow stronger and more competent. So it could be yoga, for example, Pilates, martial arts, dancing, making things with your hands, might be sort of sculpture or pottery. And it's really up to each individual to you know, kind of find that. It could be musical instruments, obviously, playing guitar or piano, any instrument. Things like kind of singing or painting, photography, yeah, I think is really important as well. So yeah, so ideally one thing would be good. So it could be, you know, taking up sport again. That's great. If you can do something else, like learn a musical instrument or make something or dance, brilliant. That's great. And if you marry that with the philosophy that you're learning and finding a mentor, then we're really, you know, you're really sort of building your life into, you know, and there are things you can do without taking huge risks and leaving your job. You know, you don't need to take huge risks to start with. You can just start by, you know, following somebody that you find interesting, that's doing things you'd like to be doing, and invest in yourself in that way, and that will over time probably lead you towards, as it did with myself, like sort of, you know, finding people like Neil Donald Walsh and Wayne Dyer led me to exploring meditation, led me to exploring, you know, Buddhism, different types of meditation, led me to exploring counseling and psychology. You know, psychology kind of became like, well, it's all about the brain, isn't it, and the body and the soul connecting. So, you know, other people will find their own ingredients and come up with their own solutions to having a more meaningful, purposeful life. And one of the things we need to do to kind of get there is find our values. Often people don't know what they really value. They've integrated, they sort of taken in other people's values, or society's values, culture's values, their partner's values, their parents' values, and they often tell me, I don't know what my values are, which is interesting. And it can take some time. So the way I go about that is to go back to what were your values when you were growing up. You know, literally, what did you value in terms of what did you play with? Who did you spend time with? What were your values when you were leaving school or going into work or higher education? What do you know, and what are the values of the company that you work for now, the work that you do now? How does that meet the values that you had when you were growing up? And so what does that say about your values now? So by putting those kind of three or four value systems together from childhood or from adolescence, one childhood, one adolescence, one from what you're doing now in your day to day, and we can find out what are your values now, and that can help us decide what to do next in life.
Interesting. Yeah, there's a model that the Hinsa use, which they call the core and social responsibility, and they say that, okay, if you're not sure exactly your values or what you stand for, what do you think other people would say? And you write out this whole list, and then you say, okay, well, look, there's 5 or 6 things that kind of fall in the same category. There's 5 or 6 things here that fall in another category. So what would you label those categories as? And then you say, well, do you agree with that? And so you may have a social persona that's not actually in alignment with your own core. And then
Quite
it's
likely,
like,
yeah.
yeah, and then it's like, okay, it's like those people pleasers. You're saying,
Yes,
they're at work, they say yes, yes, yes. And what do you think people would say about you? Oh, I'm reliable, I'm trustworthy, I'm honest, I'm unflappable, I can take anything in my stride. And what do you think about yourself? Well, actually, I'm running on a treadmill. I have no idea what I'm doing. Okay, so there's a big disconnect, right, between the two things. So,
Yes.
so in your ebook, it has the 6 steps to live more authentic on purpose. Do you get into values in that as well?
A little bit. It's very short. I wanted it to be very bite-sized so that people are very busy. You can just kind of absorb it in a few minutes. And then, so the idea is that if you go to beauthenticonpurposecoaching.com/free e-guide, which will be in the link.
Yeah, we'll put that below.
Yeah. That's great. Yeah. So you then sign up to get the ebook for free, and you also get onto my mailing list where you'll get other great free content that's hopefully helpful and useful to you, and you'll get some other free ebooks further down the line, and an opportunity to do a one-to-one coaching session with me, and then work towards perhaps doing a course further down the line. But yeah, it's all kind of drip fed. I've done it quite gradually rather than a big kind of book of, which is well, one, it can be quite overwhelming, and 2, people just possibly won't read it because it's too big. Yeah, so I found that keeping things small and very easy to absorb and just try safely. And the idea is that it's impactful and life changing, but very very gentle as well, and just like not high risk. Like, we don't want people to be taking high risk. I do sometimes work with people in that way, where it's more about, well, perhaps there is a possibility that we need to educate our employer about your rights and your what does your contract actually say your role is, and I treat therapy and coaching sessions as medical appointments. I advise people to say, you don't need to say what you're going to if you're leaving work early to come and see me. You say, same as if you were going to a dental appointment, you're having a root canal. You wouldn't necessarily tell them that, would you? You'd say, I need to leave early for an important medical surgery, technically, and that might be happening over the next few weeks until it's sorted out, and they would be legally obliged to say, okay, great, okay, we'll see you tomorrow. It's exactly the same with your mental health, and I think that is something that really needs to change in the workplace. Is that mental health is no different really to getting your teeth or your body repaired.
Let's talk about mental health in the young. Something I've observed from living in Nicaragua, there seems to be, maybe it's a cultural thing, maybe it's an environmental thing, I'm not sure, but there doesn't seem to be this as much depression or anxiety in the young people in Nicaragua as there are in the UK. So when I come back to the UK, and this is just my observation, so I might be wrong, but there seems to be an epidemic of anxiety and depression amongst teenagers, with some not even leaving their rooms, and a lack of social interaction. Is that observation true, or is it?
Yeah,
it is.
I think it is. Yeah,
Right,
from working. Okay, so I've been working in a school which is for young people that have been excluded from mainstream school for behavioural problems, and I'd say 80% of them or more are diagnosed with ADHD, autism, and other diagnostics. Now, if you look at the backgrounds of most of these young people, they don't have bad parents. Their parents are well intended, but there seems to be a lack of helpful knowledge, and many of them I speak to, their parents haven't read storybooks to them, haven't told them stories, haven't made up stories even. Um, they haven't, sort of watched a lot of film, or more than like very short cartoons. So what are they doing? They're every single one of them, I can tell you, is playing on video games,
Right.
like in their free time outside school as their main interest and activity.
Yeah.
They're not going to judo classes or karate classes. They're not going to football. And I've kind of, come to the conclusion that the effects of video games and maybe other thing, I think it's certainly true with other, a lot of them will drinking things like energy drinks, and the older ones will be vaping as well.
Yes.
From from the age of about 14, they'll be vaping and drinking energy drinks on the way into school and when they leave school. So you imagine what that's doing to their system. They can't regulate. They're not able to sort of make informed decisions. They're just reacting all the time. They're overstimulated, and then they're going home to play these, games like GTA and Fortnite and things like that, and nobody's questioning it. And even the GPs and other social workers, other people in their field are not really saying a lot about any of this. They're not really questioning it. So I'm pretty convinced that in Nicaragua that isn't what they're doing. And I think other parts of the world, for economic reasons, often they don't have these things, but that's in this case, it's a good thing. And I think there's, a lot of, again, unaccountability on the video games industry. I'm not saying all video games are bad. I certainly enjoyed it when I was growing up, but we had to go to an amusement arcade where you'd have a few pounds to spend. A few pounds would run out in an hour or two at the most. And then you went home and you just thought, that was nice. I enjoyed that. That was fun. Go back another time. And you had these very limited games at home that took a long time to kind of load up and were limited in terms of their stimulation. But now these games are so stimulating with these headsets. And, there are many children, they're not even listening to music anymore. So they're not watching films, they're not learning stories, and they're not listening to artists. They're not being inspired, by pop stars and singers. And their whole world revolves around characters that don't exist and situations that don't really exist. And it's being encouraged more and more to get these headsets and spend more and more time in virtual reality. I don't see how that's a good thing.
No, and you feel like that's causing their anxiety and depression in the real world.
Yes, because it's triggering lots of dopamine and cortisol and other adrenaline, and then when they're coming off it, they're not even. I mean, my own son, he'll come off a game, and you'd think he'd be like, oh, that was fun. He's, you can see right away he's like down, that he's had to stop, and then his mood and his attitude is not good. So none of that is being addressed, and no one's kind of saying, well, do we need to think about this? And these labels are just being, these diagnostic labels are just being dished out very, very, you basically answer a few questions and say, oh yeah, you've got ADHD. That's a clinical thing. Here's some medication. So who benefits from that? The pharmaceutical industry. Yeah. So nobody's invested. I mean, obviously there is research into the harm that modern culture is causing and gaming is causing, but it's not really been given the publicity it needs. And, it's almost like how the alcohol industry is, how they kind of, to some extent, control the mindset of the healthcare industry. Like, one glass of wine is okay, but, you can have one or two a day. That's not bad for you. And it's like, well, how true is that even? Not that I recommend not drinking alcohol at all. I don't think that at all. I think it can be enjoyable, it can be relaxing, but not if it's. I don't think it should be your main way of relaxing. And I don't think video gaming should be the main way that a child experiences the world and develops and learns about the world.
It is interesting. I've got a 10-year-old son, and I've just noticed that the games don't finish. He's like, oh,
yes,
let me know when you finish the game. It's like, oh, it doesn't finish. All right, cool. So then we're going to have to stop.
Yes.
And then what I find with him is I stop and he's like, I'm hungry. And and what he may well be hungry, but I don't think he is, because what he wants is a sugary treat. And so it's the dopamine. It's as soon as that dopamine, he's playing his video game, it drops and he needs another hit from somewhere else.
100%, yeah. Or sometimes I think they don't notice that they're hungry or even thirsty. Sometimes I've come in and seen my son on a game for sometimes a couple of hours, and he's not noticed that he hasn't drank any water or had anything to eat for a few hours, or been to the toilet. So it can be either or, and it just completely absorbs them. And they seem to, want to avoid. They'll sort of come up with almost any reason to not do anything that would take them away from the game. I do think it's an addiction.
Very addictive.
I think it's very addictive, and I don't totally agree with completely banning things either. I don't think that helps. I think you make it a bigger attraction. But so it's there needs to be more guidelines and more. I think it needs to be more regulated, right, in terms of what they're allowed to recommend, and actually health warnings, and also educating parents and carers around limit this to maybe a few hours a week at the most, because it will trigger these chemicals in your child's brain, which is not good for development when they're still growing up in particular. Okay. As an adult, I just wanted to finish with, as an adult, I just noticed that when I play video games, I enjoy it for a few minutes, and I start to find it frustrating because the learning curve is so great. It's just more enjoyable to pick up a guitar or something and just be like, do something you can't really make a mistake in the same way.
All right. So let's tie this all together. So we have young people who potentially increase anxiety and depression from video games, but also they're looking for the dopamine, the chemical hit.
Exactly. Yeah.
Then we have these professionals who have lost themselves in their work, and we can help them find their purpose. But we could also perhaps bring those two groups together and help both teenagers and professionals find something outside video games and work. Would I be right in thinking that?
Definitely. Yeah, definitely. And then video games has become something that you can do if you want to, when you're not doing your music or your martial arts or your football or your singing or dancing, all those other really great healthy things that we're designed to do. We're not designed to sit in chairs. We've got bodies that move and have these complex digits that can do amazing things. Our hands and feet, our mouths, our faces can do amazing things. That's what we're for, isn't it? We're not there to just kind of sit doing this. Absolutely, I think that is what's really missing in our culture is and some of these ancient arts like karate and things are dying out. People are just not taking. The clubs are closing, and some of these dance classes, some of these ancient kind of practices of people just aren't taking them up anymore, which is really sad.
Yeah. Okay, so you mentioned your website, authenticonpurpose.com. Is that the best way for people to reach you?
That's the best way to get my e-guide, 6 Steps to Live More Authentically on Purpose. There's also mindbodycounselling.co.uk, which gives a broader view and more information about my therapies and the types of therapies types of issues I work with, the types of therapies I offer, and the coaching that I do as well. So yes, those two things will give you plenty of information, and also give the opportunity to book a free call. I offer free 15-minute get to know you call, and then I'm even doing free initial Zoom meetings these days, just to kind of give people a chance to get to know me properly before they commit to making a bigger investment in a course of work.
Makes sense. Well, thank you, Paul. Thank you very much for being on the show.
Also, no, it's been great to be. I've really enjoyed talking with you today, Ed, and great to see you again. Thank you. Thanks for having me.
Thank you for joining me in my conversation with Paul Weeden. Now, if you're enjoying listening to and learning from this podcast, please leave me a comment. And you can also leave a suggestion for a future podcast guest that you would like us to feature. In addition, on Apple, you can leave us up to a 5-star review, and you can also leave comments there. If you want my direct help, please send me an email, ed@edpaget.com, or visit my website, edpaget.com. And lastly, but certainly not least, thank you for your interest in lifestyle medicine.